Hi everyone, Janara Nuremberg here, and this is Divergent Ideas, our new series. I'm super excited to have Mohammed Soliman here today. He's a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute and the author of the brand new book, West Asia. Mohammed, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. This is exciting.
Yeah, I know you're in DC. I really want to start with your journey, where you grew up and how you landed on this topic.
Wow, this is a long story, but the short answer is I'm born and raised in Cairo, engineer by training, and I came of age following the invasion of Iraq and then the Arab Spring. So I would say that I was activated to think about big ideas and the global map through the length of those two big inflection points, Iraq War and the Arab Spring. I moved to Washington so many years ago to do my grad degree, and this is where I met my wife. And I have been working at the Middle East Institute and a company called McCarty Associates. So my work is more on brand strategy, technology, how this impact emerging markets.
I love that. Okay, I kind of want to dial into the Arab Spring part. People probably know I'm in Kathmandu now. I was here when the Arab Spring was happening. So where exactly were you?
I was in Tahrir Square, which a chapter of my life that was very interesting. I was a teenager, late teens, I guess. It was a deeply impactful moment for a lot of people. It was a moment of hope, thinking about what's the future of Arab societies and the way forward. And it shaped me to the man who I am right now. I don't believe that I hold the same ideas I used to many years ago, but clearly it was a big chapter in my life.
Wow, that's amazing. I remember just watching Al Jazeera and seeing the coverage and yeah, feeling the energy from afar. And Nepal is kind of an interesting place to be. We had a lot of laborers traveling to the Middle East at that time. Not so much to, Egypt and North Africa, but the Gulf states and Qatar. And so it was kind of an interesting burgeoning relationship between the two regions. So, okay, so how exactly did it lead you on this route? Did it have you think about leadership specifically, or international partnerships, diplomacy, IR? What exactly did it kind of set in motion for you?
It's an inflection point in history. It was a point in history where we're trying to think about what's the way forward and how to get there, and whatever there means. And part of me at that time was thinking about the question of governance as the cornerstone for stability and progress. I think I changed my views on that. I think I became much more in the realpolitik tradition, thinking that balance of power, enforcing balance of power between nations and states, in the case of the Middle East, could be a better, like I would say, a better scenario than that sort of fluidity that I would argue has undermined a lot of societies. Uh, those are the questions that I have been chasing for quite some time. Are we better off with the civil wars that we have seen, specifically in Syria, Iraq, in Libya, and Yemen, or should we have thought about a better accommodation? And more importantly, the question of Iran and the rise of Iran after Iraq War. And this is why the theme of balance of power you'll always see in the book front and center, because I believe that this invasion of Iraq and the scenario that we have seen unfolding afterwards, in terms of Iran being able to control or brag about controlling four Arab cities,
Mhm.
Sana'a and Damascus and Baghdad and Beirut. I think it was a very so it was a very tough moment for the Middle East. And I think the question for me was, okay, so how can we achieve this balance of power? How can you rebuild this balance of power? How can you think about the question of law and order in the broader region? Because one of the main diagnoses that I have for the problem in the book is that the Middle East as traditionally conceived, is under-institutionalized region. It doesn't have institutions to manage those relationships between the states. We have one or two legacy organizations, but they don't really come up with the needs or the things that we really need. We don't have an EU. We don't have NATO. We don't have, forget about even the European organizations. Think about even the organizations we have in the Indo-Pacific Quad, Squad, the Indo-Pacific Partnership Framework. We don't really have those frameworks in the Middle East. So my book is trying to work with the Middle East as it is and say that those frameworks are needed. Those frameworks are extremely important. But in thinking about frameworks, we also should rethink about who constitutes this Middle East and what's the Middle East and what are the borders of the Middle East. In the case of the book, I am always referring to the Middle East as West Asia. This is the case of the book, that the borders between Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean have collapsed, and now we're dealing with a system that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. So you will see me calling for rethinking about the role that Mediterranean European nations would play, France, Greece, Italy. You'll also see me in the book talking about how the Gulf South Asia is merging, and you can see that through trade between India and United Arab Emirates, trade between India and Saudi Arabia. And so this is my own way to find the solution for the missing pounds of power. Expanding the map, zooming out, figuring out what really is the Middle East. Is it really the Middle East, or is part of larger system, which is Asia, in the case that I make across the book? And by doing that, maybe we can create that sort of stability, bringing back order to the region.
That's amazing. Okay, I have so many questions. As I mentioned to you before, I was just in Oman and I learned so much about this historical relationship, especially with India and the traders from India, and, even eating the food, seeing the similarities, and having lived and worked in South Asia for a very long time. I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which borders and, on a visual level and a linguistic level become so cemented and entrenched in our minds, especially those of us who grow up in the West, and we kind of think very concretely in terms of boxes. This region is referred this way, this region is referred that way. What do you think will kind of help break through that? Obviously, your book is a huge argument for that, but is there kind of like a re-education that needs to happen, or what do you think?
Tough question. Listen, we don't have to be fixated on words. And this is something I say across the book. I am saying I'm a realist, so I'm not even rethinking about the Middle East as West Asia from an anti-colonial tradition. I'm even thinking about it from a realpolitik tradition. I am saying this is the system as it is today, and I'm using examples, concrete examples from trade, commerce, immigration, and the security networks that confirm my thesis. And I'm not saying go rename every single Middle East department West Asia, therefore my book has succeeded. That's not really my argument. My argument is this is extremely important for, most importantly, for American policymakers who are rethinking about American power in the 21st century. Two, it's very important for policymakers and scholars and investors who exist in those places, into those cities across the West Asian landscape, from Athens, Rome, to Cairo, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, to Delhi, and even Islamabad. I'm saying you have to rethink about the question of geography, but because by thinking in those new terms, you understand what's needed to be done, what's your interest, and why you need this West Asian system to succeed and to be established. In the case of Europe, I make the case that this is the new orientation for Europe after the invasion of Ukraine. You need a different geoeconomic identity. This means that you have to be connected to the capital markets in the Gulf, energy sources in the Gulf. You need to seek a different relationship with India. So it makes perfect sense you have to embrace the West Asian system. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Gulf is a central node in this connecting Eurasian rimland from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And they are playing that role through air travel. You travel across Asia from Europe to Asia through the airlines in Dubai, in Doha, and Riyadh. The same thing applies to logistics, to ports, Dubai ports, immigration, and how the Gulf is a central node into the system. So being part of West Asia is extremely important for the Gulf centrality. And then India, and I make the case that India is not part of this East Asian economic order. It's a country that's unique in terms of geography, so it needs a different axis, it needs a different orientation, and this orientation is the West, is West Asia. So I'm trying to make the realist case for why West Asia is the real region, the real definition, the real geography, and why those capitals, including Washington, should embrace it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. Like, this is just the reality. So you're kind of just fleshing it out. You're not advocating for some like rebranding or something. So it makes a lot of sense. I think that it's obviously most appreciated when you are here on the ground, and you see it and you feel it. When I was in Dubai, so many people from South Asia. Same thing in Oman. So many people from South Asia. And I think for me personally, it was a kind of a eye-opening, reconfiguring kind of moment for me personally, not having spent a lot of time in the Gulf before. I spent so much time in South Asia, Turkey, all over Europe, a lot of East Asia, but being in the Gulf kind of tied it all together for me. I think that's when your work literally came across my thread, my feed, like through the algorithms. So talk to me more about some specifics. I'm very curious about the sort of the trade corridors and trade networks that are emerging. And I don't have your book yet, so I don't know how much you've gone into that. But what are some key points that people should know?
Nera, let me say that first. You had the same moment that I had in Saudi Arabia. So this book was born out of this demographic reality. When you are in Saudi Arabia and seeing the fusion between Europeans, Brits, South Asians, and Arabs who are living and working in the same city in Jeddah, you come to a different realization about geography, about people, about where we are in history. And the same thing in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha. So I agree with you. I think being in the Gulf and seeing that sort of fusion was extremely impactful on me. And I would argue that I wrote the book because of this. I wrote the book when I was in Saudi Arabia. I started writing it when I was in Saudi Arabia, seeing this sort of demographic fusion, people from everywhere, and how the city and the system looks more Asian than just an Arab in isolation from this broader Asian identity. To your direct question on trade, I am making the case in the book that there is a multi-civilizational system that existed before the Portuguese landed on the shores of India. And I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to claim that I am. But so many respectful historians have talked about this and wrote about this. And I'm making the reference to a book that was deeply impactful on my thinking, which is Before You Bring Hegemony by Janet Abulukht. And she was describing these sort of systems that were overlapped. And this is in 2050 to 1350. The Mamluks in Egypt, the Italian city-states, and the different states in India, and how those systems were overlapping and creating connectivity around trade, and most importantly, knowledge. The system that I'm describing today is not new. It's more of a return of history. And I know return of history is always a cliche term to use, but in this case, I truly believe that this is almost like a return of history. Different dynamics, different power centers, but pretty much the same app and pretty much the same interlinked interactions and systems that you're seeing today, especially between India, the Gulf, Red Sea, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea. And in the book, I'm tracing those trade volumes. I mean, think about the EU-India trade is north of 130, $140 billion. The India-UE trade is $100 billion alone. Could be doubled in the next 5 years. The India-Saudi Arabia trade is north of 45 billion and will be doubled as well. So just to give you an idea about the scale, India-EU, which was seen as the trade deal, the mother of all trade deals, as Prime Minister Modi called it few weeks ago, is important. But put it in comparison with whatever is taking place between India and the Gulf states, I think it's very impressive to see.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also tracing demography. You have more than 8 million Indians working in the Gulf states, sending back home close to $30 billion every year, remittances, close to 3% of the Indian GDP. That's extremely impressive. I'm also tracing the question of AI infrastructure. And I know that, of course, did not really exist before. This is completely new. But when you're tracing, for example, what the United Arab Emirates is doing in terms of building, financing AI infrastructure in France, in Italy, in Greece, also in India, how this nod and how they're becoming this connective tissue for AI infrastructure between the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean is extremely telling about that this region is taking shape. And then I'm using two initiatives by Washington as an example as well. I am using the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that was announced on the sidelines of the G20 in Delhi in 2023 as an example, because when I started writing this book, it was very hard for me to give people a mental map about what I mean by West Asia. It was very difficult. I think the India, Middle East, Europe corridor as a map was helpful. Oh, this is what I mean. That those countries, those sub-regions are actually interlinked. And you can see this through trade, demography, and capital flow and AI. And it's time for us to build institutions to do this sort of integration.
Mm-hmm.
The second one was the ITU2, the India, Israel, US, UE initiative as well, because 4 different countries, I would say completely different geographies, what brings them together. So it's the rethinking about the question of geography that I am trying to shed a light on during the whole book. And let me say this, I am not fixated on one single initiative. I'm not fixated on the India Middle East corridor or the ITU2 or what have you. I am saying this region doesn't really have institutions. So let's build some mini naturals that bring those completely separated subregions together on questions that will lead to more integration.
Mm-hmm. What about I think it's the GCC. Is that what there's some kind of unifying term?
The Gulf Cooperation countries.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know much about it, but what does that serve as some kind of cohesive identity making coalition or what is the purpose of it?
So GCC stands for the Gulf Cooperation Council. And this council was founded in the 80s and includes Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. Those are the main Gulf states. And you can see it's as far north as Kuwait, as far south as Oman. And the Gulf Cooperation Council was more of a unified Gulf response to the rise of 2 hegemons nearby the Gulf. One was Iran, specifically, and that has always been the historical case, before or after 1979 revolution. And the rise of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The fear was we have to work together because we're facing the same threat. And those 2 countries are emboldened and might have some ambitions, which it ended up being the case. In the case of Saddam Hussein, the invasion of Kuwait, right after the end of the Cold War. And of course, in the case of Iran, through ideological interference, and most importantly, they occupied 3 Emirati islands in the Gulf. And the Gulf Cooperation Council, of course, is a leadership-led council, but it did deliver for the broader Gulf in terms of things as simple as identity, as visa, your ID cards, paying fines, traffic. But it still did not go to the EU level integration.
Right.
Did not go into the integration between European nations. Someone would argue maybe because the EU integration is a very exceptional project. The EU integration itself is unique. I mean, who else has the same level of harmonization from currency to passport to border security? I mean, this is a very, I would say someone would argue that this is very unique to our friends in Europe. But so far, I mean, GCC is a very important tool, and it's active on so many international initiatives. For example, and I discussed this at length in the book, the GCC EU framework or summit that takes place every year. And then the GCC ASEAN summit, which is very interesting to see that, right? It's GCC EU, GCC ASEAN. So this is the rimland of Eurasia. And the GCC is the center node there. Part of it is their capital deployment, energy providers. They have the space, they have the political commitment. So now they're emerging as a node across the Eurasian rimland. So GCC is playing a role also as a bloc. But let's be frank, we're also in a very fluid international system that states are willing to play outside of rigid formats. And clearly you see this even in the case of Europe. I mean, we had the Board of Peace in Washington here a few days ago. And despite the fact that we know that Europeans were not supposed to be attending or they're boycotting it, you had some states attending, right? I mean, so the idea of maintaining doing international relations through the length of big organizations like EU or UN, I think, I'm not going to say fading away, but it's not the primary, they're not the primary unit of action.
What are potential barriers to this grand idea? Like what within sort of the Gulf region? I mean, we know that some of these countries are already kind of at odds. There are some conflicts currently taking place. How do you see that playing out in terms of like if there were to be a very solid identity and the Gulf played kind of a central role in this framing of West Asia, and yet sort of being cautious of like intergroup fracturing happening?
And you say it yourself, I think any conflict between those GCC nations will always overshadow regional integration. Those are very powerful nations, very wealthy nations, and acting at a global level, at a global scale. They're projecting power in East Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East. So they're very powerful nations. And now you're not discussing France or Britain fighting in the Horn of Africa or East Africa. It's Gulf players. The countries that are mediating between great powers are now in the Gulf. I mean, the Saudis and the Emiratis hosted numerous talks between Ukraine and Russia. The Qatar mediated between the United States and Taliban. The UAE mediated between India, Pakistan, Eritrea, Ethiopia. So this is a completely different role for the Gulf, very new and very consequential as well. So any fight between those players will always have an impact, not only on the Gulf, but also on the outer region, on the wider region. The second thing is great power dynamics. America is the most powerful player, security-wise, globally, and in West Asia. So whatever America does will have an impact. So if the United States is deliberating, taking action against Iran, that's going to have an impact on everyone, right? Because what you're going to do about infrastructure in the Gulf, can America guarantee security, safety, protection, or no? The third dynamic here is the Palestinian question. Regional integration means what's the future of the Palestinian people? Will they be stateless, or will they be granted a state? And again, no one in the Gulf is fixated on the conditions under the state. I think everyone believes that determination is at the end of the day, is what's needed for a true regional integration. So I say those are the top three factors impacting broader regional integration.
And what about the relationship with China? That's something I haven't looked into extensively, but just, with China's reach around the world, is there like competition there? Is China closer with the UAE versus Oman, or what is that something you get into in the book?
I do, but let me add this. I wrote this book because I believe that there is an Asian system that exists beyond the shadow and question of China.
Mhm.
I wrote the book because I believe that there is an integration around the Asian rimland that extends from East Asia, from Tokyo to Riyadh,
Mhm.
exists with or without China. And those players, through trade, commerce, people travel, security networks, diplomacy, have created de facto Asian system. Even though this is a book for American policymakers advocating for American grand strategy, I'm not trying to take agency away. I am saying in the book, this Asian system exists, and America will be missing the picture if we decided that the only lens we're using to think about this Asianization of the Middle East
Mhm.
is that this is only driven by China. I'm making the case that the Asianization of the Middle East is because of the other Asian powers. Which country built the nuclear program in the United Arab Emirates? It's Korea. Which country that launched the Emirati space mission? It was Japan. Which country sells the most number of cars in Saudi Arabia? It's Japan. Which country has the biggest number of expats in the Gulf? It's India. Which country? I mean, when you go through
Mhm.
the region in terms of number and data, you will see an Asian story. And of course, China is part of it. China is part of it, but China is not the main driver of what we're seeing here. I think it is the Asianization of the Middle East is the theme of the book.
Mhm.
And the reason why I'm honing on that sort of theme, because when you start seeing other Asian players there and Gulf players as Asian players over there in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, you will start rethinking about how you should engage.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I appreciate that. Yeah, since I'm not in the policy world and I kind of write, for a much more general audience, I'm always kind of translating these ideas and insights for what it means for your everyday person. In my case, like a fellow traveler or something. And, to go back to what we were saying earlier, it's something you really feel when you're there and you're on the ground. And I've been in the Asia region for 20 years. And so I have such a deep familiarity and affection for the region more broadly. And going to the Gulf states really kind of just felt like an extension of that. And it was really a beautiful feeling. But I know that's not the purpose of your book necessarily. So on that note, what, how are these ideas landing in your circle in DC when you talk to people? Does this feel like something that is brand new for people that they've never sort of conceived of Asia and the, West Asia, being so closely linked? Is this something you're having to kind of sort of re-educate people about, or does it seem fairly intuitive to people once they kind of wrap their heads around it?
I was surprised how so many people who engage with me on the issue do not think about the Middle East from the length of Asia, as if it is completely new, as if what I am saying is some new invention. And I'm saying in the book, I am not inventing West Asia. I'm not inventing. I'm rediscovering the tradition. I am telling you that this is Asia as it is. I don't try to take credit. I did not come up with the name even. I am saying we need to rediscover this in Washington, in the United States, in Europe.
Hmm.
because this is very important for the way forward. And maybe the reason why people were not thinking about the Middle East through the length of Asia is few things. One is the conception of Middle East itself as a region is very much a relic of the British Empire. British interest from the Mediterranean to Egypt, South Asia to Singapore. Second, it is oil politics of the 20th century, which made the Middle East as if it is like a silo sub-region that's not really connected to an Asian system. Three is proximity to Europe. So the idea of Asia, Europe maybe didn't make any sense to folks, and how we should think about the Mediterranean Sea. Four, because any question of Asia means a question of China, and Asia is being reduced to the question of China. I would say this is my diagnosis why people had this sort of reaction to the book, that this is something new, even though I don't believe it's new.
Yeah, totally. I can really appreciate what you're saying. I bumped into an editor here for a very prominent magazine, and I was telling him I was interviewing you, and I was like, "Oh, it's like this, really interesting frame of West Asia." And he was like, "Oh, we've been using that for decades." And I'm like, "That makes sense. That totally makes sense that people here on the ground in this region would have, of course, a very different orientation, and that the idea of, Middle East or Far East is, obviously a very kind of Europe centric way of viewing, the other and far off regions, and it feels a bit outdated." But I'm actually surprised to hear that that was your experience. I don't know. I think of people in diplomacy circles as being very well traveled, especially if people have served in, you know, embassies and done a lot of like sort of diplomatic work, consular work. Those are the types of people that I bump into all the time here as well. Yeah, so why do you think that that is? Is it just a lack of exposure, lack of experience?
I don't think so. I think we have a lot of experience. I think people travel a lot. I would argue that American scholars, intellectuals are very well-traveled people, actually. Like, given my travel and given that I go to Europe, I go to Asia, I spend time in the Gulf, and I see different sorts of elites coming from different nationalities. I don't buy the critique that Americans do not travel at all. I completely disagree. I think the Americans that I see are always impressive and always very well traveled, well thought. I mean, what nation on earth you're going to have cities like New York when you have 200 languages in the same space? I mean, America is a very truly diverse society, and its own elite structure is very exposed to a lot of geographies. I think it is America as a great power inherited a lot of intellectual work
Uh-huh.
that came from London.
That makes
And
sense.
again, I'm a realist. I don't really come into this question from the anti-colonial tradition. I'm just saying American elites did inherit a lot of intellectual work, a lot of intellectual conception about geography
Mm-hmm.
that came out of London after the end of the British Empire, the transition from the British Empire to the American Empire or American power. And some of those conceptions made sense for London. It did make sense for London, but it doesn't make sense for Washington, a nation that's deeply embedded in the Western Hemisphere, completely separated from the Eurasian landmass by the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the Middle East as Middle East, that is not part of an Asian system. Because I'm also making the case in the book, because at the end of the day, this is a book on American grand strategy as well. So I have to discuss what America is, what America stands for, American power, American grand strategy. I'm making the case that America is entering a Pacific century, that America itself is changing its own identity to become a much more Pacific power. This is where the energy is. This is where the economic growth is. This is where the demographics are. And I don't really pretend that America is European nation. I don't see it anymore. I think America as a republic is a completely different civilizational project in the 21st century than the 20th century. And that will have a deep impact on how you're rethinking about geography. And there's a very concrete example for that. How the Americans did follow the advice that came out of Tokyo, the former or the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, to redefine the geography of the Asia Pacific as the Indo-Pacific. That was one of the biggest redefinition of geographies that we have ever done. We literally changed the scope of an area of responsibility for the US military. We decided that we're not going to be north-south axis. We're going to be thinking about the map through east-west reconfiguration. So I'm making the case that I agree 100% with Shinzo Abe about redefinition of the map. I'm saying, well, I want you to expand the map to the Arabian Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, because this is an Eurasian rimland integration project. And America, as an offshore balancer, or it should be an offshore balancer, is going to be one of the drivers for that sort of Eurasian rimland integration.
That is amazing. I really need to get your book. Got to get it sent out here to Kathmandu. But I really love that. Yes, everyone, go buy it. I think it's just so interesting. So much of what you just said is really interesting. Again, translating to the personal, I grew up in the city of San Francisco, and my experience as a kid growing up in the States was that literally 70% of my school was Asian American. And I've written about this a lot, but it really, really shaped my sense of identity, sense of the world, the people that I connected with, the families whose homes I would spend time in after school and that kind of thing. And so I myself have been very integrated into sort of the broader Asian diaspora for my whole life. So I can really appreciate the argument that you're making. And then when I think as a journalist, as a writer, and somebody who has been chronicling polarization, and I wrote about cancel culture quite a bit in my last book. I think that there's probably a huge contingent in the United States that would really not agree with you and not like this reframing, right? Kind of thinking in terms of the broader Indo-Pacific, perhaps even clumping the US into some kind of Asian system. So how do you see this playing out? I feel I can imagine if I were in your shoes, if I was either in, the West Coast or the East Coast, that these ideas would land in terms of, yeah, some elite circles or, people are in academia who would really kind of understand these points. But what about kind of the average general kind of American public, what we're seeing, especially on the right now? Don't you think there would be kind of a deep opposition to this argument that you're making?
America is an interesting moment in its history when it comes to its foreign policy priorities. Foreign policy is becoming domestic policy for so many reasons. And this is, I mean, maybe you and I should co-author a book on this.
Okay.
Part of it is this is the post-Iraq War impact on American society. Truly, I believe so. I believe that Iraq was deeply impactful on America internally. So you're always going to have suspicion of interventions. And there's a reason why you have this growing, I would say on a bipartisan level, some sort of suspicion of calls for intervention. That's Iraq War. Second is that this is no longer the end of history. America has completely different security threat perception and profile. You have seen what happened in Mexico a few days ago. You have seen how the Western Hemisphere is becoming front and center to American domestic politics, right? This is no longer a bunch of staffers in Congress trying to think about the question of Venezuela and Cuba and Mexico. This is almost an everyday issue around question of immigration, and you have seen how immigration became front and center for American politics for what, 20 years now, since George Bush's second term. The question of war and terror, the question of war on drugs and drug flow coming from the southern borders. So that's a completely different perception.
Mhm.
And no matter what you say, there is a domestic audience that wants to rethink about American foreign policy priorities from the interest of their domestic position. And there's no way around it. There's no way around it. I mean, actually, it's core to the question of democracy. It's literally what voters thinking about it, interested in solving. Again, and this is where the left versus right divide comes in, which is the solution, but not the diagnosis, not the problem. That's I think the perceptions itself has changed on bipartisan level about the security threat perception of the United States.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I think about these themes a ton, especially I've been thinking a lot about security and the theme of security and how people conceptualize security and being abroad, being in South Asia, thinking about the identity of small states in particular, the rise of empire, the fall of empire. It's a really fascinating time to be alive and to be documenting all of this and witnessing all of this. I kind of feel like what you're saying is that painting this picture of where America fits in the broader kind of Asian ecosystem is where we should go and is where we need to go. And I really agree with that. And I think you're probably a little ahead of your time there. I think what I'm kind of thinking about is how does that translate to the public? When I think about, the kind of resurgence of uh, a kind of grasping on to the Christian identity of the US. I think that's what we're seeing play out. And that is very real and very alive, I think, for a lot of people in the US. I also think what's very alive is this kind of rapidly changing demographic that strategically should be kind of more Asian, if you will. But it's so hard to imagine those two frames or those two ways of conceptualizing the US or thinking about the future of the US coming together. And this might be a little off topic or a tangent, but it really feels like this tension to me between people who have left the US, spent a lot of time outside the US, pay attention to global trends, and can kind of say, like, yes, that's where we're going, or that's where we need to go. That will strengthen our position. And then this other demographic of people who are really rooting down, want to hold on to our old identity, the kind of European roots of the country. And I appreciate the distinction you made between kind of the 20th century, 21st century. So yeah, I don't know what you make of that, but
This is a very tough question. So let me take a crack at it. America is a very exceptional country. I'm not using exceptional country from a liberal hegemony standpoint. America is a very big nation, 330 million people. It's a really sizable population. And America has a global reach. And America has, I would say, diverse society. And like you said, different views, different perspectives. But this is not unique to the United States. The idea that you have society that's polarized or fragmented or thinking differently or wants to redefine the identity of the state and project of the state. That's not new to the United States. I contend with this issue. It's not unique to the United States. It's everywhere. The only difference is that America is a great power. So when you are thinking in those terms and having those sort of intellectual fights, they're not intellectual fights. They have global ramifications by virtue of American power and American power projection. That's my take on it.
Okay.
But the fights in America, the intellectual fights in America are not unique to America. This
Yeah.
is something I keep saying. I go spend time overseas, and the fights I see overseas in Delhi or in London or in Tokyo or in Paris or in Cairo, they are the same. Could be even more vicious. The only difference is this is a very big nation with and great power with a very global reach that it will have ramifications on others.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm so curious to see how this all plays out and to see if yeah, to see, I don't know, we'll see. I don't know, maybe the next presidency or maybe you'll become an advisor and you can kind of push this reframing. Um, yeah, I'm so excited. I'll reach out to your publisher, make sure I can get a copy of the book. And yeah, is there anything else that you'd want to share about your takeaways before we wrap up?
Thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic. I really enjoy it. It was a really great interview. Those were very thoughtful questions. It was very expansive. We started with personal Arab Spring and ended up talking about American identity, American grand strategy, American priorities. So I did really enjoy this intellectual exchange with you today.
Thank you. Me too. I really love talking with you, and I'm so excited about the book. I want to wish you the best of luck, and yeah, we'll stay in touch. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.